I'm back for round three of Black History Reader, 101 Questions by Dr. Claude Anderson. Giving a reading out of here, and I'm on question three. And question three is, how has social integration failed Black America? Social integration was posited to eradicate institutional racism and remedy the negative socio-economic impact of centuries of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, but it failed. As a result, Black Americans remain burdened by the economic, social, and pathological impacts that resulted from their historical maltreatment. In his book, The Tragic Failure of Integration, liberal author Tom Weicker concludes that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream had turned into a black nightmare, and that the success of the movement failed to translate into full integration or first-class citizenship for most blacks. Nearly 60 years after the black civil rights movement was hijacked by newly created or fabricated minorities, a growing number of Black Americans are reaching the same conclusion, that they are still an out group in American society. They are learning the lesson that Jewish people in Europe learned in the 1500s when they tried to integrate into mainstream society. Jews were a hated out group. They quickly learned that to protect their group, it was better to circle the wagons than divide and scatter themselves into the larger population, making them weaker and more vulnerable. This is a lesson yet to be learned by Black Americans. After 50 years of marching and singing "We Shall Overcome Someday," they are still fixed at the bottom of American society, buried beneath an unrelenting flow of immigrants and more economically dependent than they were in the 1960s when the social integration began. The integration process made blacks unwanted guests in what whites and their sub-ethnic groups owned and controlled. Blacks still own and control less than 1% of anything of value, but bear 6 to 8 times of everything, but bear 6 to 8 times of everything that is bad or negative. A few blacks have become visible as public officials, athletes, entertainers, and media personalities, but there is little connection between their elevated public images and the low socioeconomic status of the black masses. Younger blacks are just beginning to grasp the weight of the losses of black communities, schools, businesses, culture, history, leaders, sports teams, music, and exceptionality in mainstream society. They have never had the positive experiences of living in a black community. It is increasingly difficult for blacks to become a functional part of American society without physical communities or a broad sense of community. The years between 1960 and 2014 could have produced a more self-sufficient black race if the civil rights movement had worked to address and correct the maldistribution of wealth, income, and resources that occurred because of 500 years of slavery and Jim Crow's semi-slavery. While blacks were chasing the elusive social integration dream, the horrors inflicted on blacks receded from the consciousness of society, and blacks lost their moral and political leverage. Blacks were displaced in the nation's conscience by immigrants in general and Hispanics in particular, who publicly boast of their successful efforts to totally displace blacks in every aspect of American society. In his book, Presumed Alliance, The Unspoken Conflict Between Blacks and Latinos and What It Means for America, the author, Nicholas C. Vaca, disdained a rainbow coalition and presumed alliance with Black Americans. He said that Hispanics were no longer interested in being classified as whites, that they wanted to be viewed as a minority who could compete with blacks for political and economic power. Even though Hispanics from the Caribbean islands and the Americas were descendants of slaveholders and had never been enslaved or Jim Crowed, they felt that by the mere fact that they were more socially acceptable than blacks in America, in American society, they could gain socio-economic benefits and become the nation's minority population. Their goal, according to Vaca, was to displace blacks in every way possible. As an official outgroup and primary target of conservative hate groups, there are neither rewards nor incentives for immigrants, women, LGBT, or poor whites to identify publicly with black Americans. This nation's policy of political correctness allows all of these groups to rank higher than blacks in the nation's order of social acceptability. The majority of immigrants are classified as whites. They get double benefits when they are also classified as aggrieved minorities and compete against blacks for public recognition and financial resources. Integration did not produce racial or economic equality for blacks because it was a sentiment. It was not a doctrinal commitment by white society. The dream of Dr. King and liberals of a colorblind society took the nation's focus off blacks and gave the illusion of integration and equality. It destroyed the black unity that was forced on them by segregation. By the 1960s, convinced to believe in social integration, blacks gave up their communities, their businesses, the jobs those businesses created, their sports teams, schools, professionals, and culture. By the 1970s, the immigrant groups pouring into the country created cohesive ethnic communities, often in the same physical locations that blacks were beginning to vacate. Integration was a failure for black Americans because they did not fully understand or appreciate the value of the communities they so eagerly abandoned. That was question 2, and Dr. Claude Anderson's answer in this book, A Black History Reader, 101 Questions You Never Asked or Never Thought to Ask by Dr. Claude Anderson. You can find it at Powernomics. I wish you would, or anybody that has already read it, to contact me. We can have some conversation and dialogue on the matter and just come to understand what we have to do to educate and re-educate our people, particularly our children. Tomorrow I'll go into question number 4. Peace.